Yo, what's going on, everybody? Welcome into another episode of Mets Daily on the Fan Arch Network. John Saponaro here with you today and every day to talk about our New York Mets. And before we get started, of course, a quick shout out goes to our friends over at Kalshi for sponsoring the video for a limited time. Use the code FANARCHBASEBALL on the Kalshi app to get $10 when you trade 10. And I should mention, if you haven't subscribed to the channel already, please go ahead and do so. We're sitting at just over 4,000 subscribers, and we are hoping to get to 5,000 by the time this miserable New York Mets season is over, because if we're going to go through it, we might as well go through it together. Jokes aside, that's exactly where we're going to start, and it's hard to say jokes aside when you're talking about the New York Mets, who have become a complete and utter laughingstock in every sense of the word. The New York Mets lose again yesterday to the Chicago Cubs, 4-3 in 10 innings. There's not much that you can say about this game except that they are a team that looks defeated. They are a team that looks how we all feel about them. They look dead in the water. They look resigned to the fact that it is over. And let me be clear when I say this, it is in fact over. It's June 26th. It's unfortunate that I have to say that on June 26th. They didn't even make it to my gauntlet that I threw down for them of 30 days when I started this show on June 1st. I took over for Jake Brown to start a new month on June 1st, the start of a new series, the start of a new month, the start of a new era of Mets Daily. And I just asked for the Mets to give us 1 month of relevancy to see if we could make the games in July count, to see if we can make the games in August count, to see if maybe, just maybe, we can make the games in September count, but they did not hold up their end of the bargain. And now the Mets have lost their 6 straight. The Mets have been swept by the Cubs in a 4-game series. The Mets have been swept by the Cubs in a doubleheader. 2 things that are very, very, very hard to do. Even when you're a bad baseball team, it's hard to get swept in a doubleheader. It's hard to get swept in a 4-game series. But don't you worry. The Mets managed to do both in the same series, in the same week. The Mets have also been swept by the Cubs in 7 games this season, which is about as bad as you can possibly do. Again, we've talked about it a lot this week with the Chicago Cubs. When you're talking about a team that isn't even some kind of powerhouse, the Chicago Cubs are better than the Mets. The Chicago Cubs should not be this much better than the Mets. But here we are. Your record is what it says you are. And the Mets are a bad baseball team. The couple things I want to touch on with this game in particular or that Freddie Peralta pitched better. He deserved better. The Mets make 2 more errors that lead to 3 unearned runs, which doomed Freddie Peralta's outing. It doomed Freddie Peralta's line, and it wound up being the difference in this game, because if the Mets don't make those errors, the Mets probably win this game 3-0. They don't get to extra innings. They don't get to the opportunity to get beaten extras, which getting beat by 1 run in extras at home with the new rules with the ghost runner is a whole nother thing. But let's be honest, if you were watching that game, and I'll be honest with you, I didn't watch much of it, you knew the Mets weren't going to come back there, right? You knew the Mets just weren't going to find a way to figure it out and get a run across and even maybe push it to the 11th. But at this point, did you even want the Mets? I mean, look, I'm adamant, I never root against my team. In football, I don't root against my team for a draft pick. In baseball, where draft picks don't even matter as much, I certainly won't root against them there. But I'm not rooting against them. But did you want the Mets to get to an 11th inning? For what? For why? You wanted to watch more Mets baseball in 2026? I'm good as far as the Mets are concerned. So I don't think I needed to watch more Mets baseball. But look, they are what their record says they are. They're a bad team. The Mets have now played 81 games in 2026. That is half a season. I know the All-Star break is still a couple weeks away, but half of the season is down the drain. And I mean down the drain. And in that half of a season, the Mets are 34-47. That is 13 games under 500. You're 13 games under 500 after 81. You ain't going anywhere, man. It's over. That is a pace of 68 wins and 94 losses over 162 games. And oh my God, how gross is that to say out loud? The Mets are done. And I hate to say it. I hate to make declarations of it. The Mets need to go like 22 games over 500 over their next 81 games, something like that, to get to like an 87 win scenario, which I think is about what it would take for the Mets or any team in the NL to make the playoffs. So is that mathematically impossible? No. But is it gonna happen? No. It's not gonna happen. You know it. I know it. And they've already started to admit to you, the Mets have, as they make their first trade. It's not a big trade, but in a way, it's a big trade. But the Mets made their first trade of what should be many trades, or at least a couple of significant trades, as the Mets look to sell off pieces and move on from the 2026 season and look ahead to 2027 and beyond. Now, there is a lot of talent on this team still. I know it doesn't feel like that right now. But a team that has Francisco Lindor and Juan Soto and, Carson Bench, AJ Ewing. I'm going to throw Francisco Alvarez into the mix just because he's a young catcher. There are pieces on this team. I don't know if Bo Bichette's going to be here or not. We'll see. Nola McLean, of course. Devin Williams is talented. Luke Weaver is talented. I don't know if he'll be here. But there are pieces. There is the makings, the groundwork, the little puzzle pieces, the Lego bricks of a good team in here somewhere. So maybe in 2027, a retooling is all they need. They need to look at what they did in 2025, 2026 offseason to, this transition into this season and see where they went wrong. And maybe they can make this work because there is the groundwork. There is the building blocks of a good team in here. But the Mets start the sell-off by trading David Peterson to the Cubs. They basically said, go to that dugout. Go ahead. Get out of here. And it actually happened right as I was recording yesterday's show. I finished. I wrapped it up. I sent it off to be edited and to be posted come the next morning. And all of a sudden, I look on my phone, I look on Twitter, and there it is. Boom. Mets trade David Peterson to the Cubs. Now, look, if you've been watching this show, if you've been a fan of mine for a while, either on Twitter or on Till Mets Do Us Part, I'm not a big fan of David Peterson. I was never a fan of David Peterson, so I am happy to see David Peterson go. I thought he was a loser mentality player. I thought he was a slump his shoulders player. I thought he was overrated at times during some of his peaks, and he did a couple good things for the Mets. He made the All-Star team last year. He deserved that. He was good down the stretch in the bullpen in 2024. Kudos to him. But by and large, David Peterson was sort of just a guy. He never lived up to the expectations, never got over the hump. This is a guy who was pitching to a 6 ERA, an ERA over 6 as a starter this season. He became unpitchable. He was one of the people alongside Mark Vientos and Kodai Senga and some other folks that just desperately need to be off of this team. And thank goodness the Mets have finally caved and have gotten rid of David Peterson. He's also the last player on the Mets from the Wilpon era. So I don't believe in curses, but if you believe in curses, maybe now we can finally turn the page. We talked a lot about how this team in 2026 feels like a Wilpon team. It feels like a team that shouldn't be owned by Steve Cohen and run by David Stearns. It feels like the Mets from, 2013, 2012, some of the really kind of Mets teams of the latter stages of the Wilpon era. But you know what? Maybe this is what changes things. Not for this season, but maybe this is the thing that they needed to do. Maybe they needed to shed the last bit of Wilpon stink off of this team, and they have managed to do that. And I will say this, I'm not a prospect guy. I'm not this person who dives deep on even Mets prospects. I know about the Mets prospects because I do this show, because I do Till Mets Do Us Part. But there are some people like Ernest Dove, like Joe DeMeo, who are really, really, really locked in on the prospects. And I do not claim to be one of those people. I'm aware of them, but there are people who are better suited to diagnose not only the Mets prospects, but prospects in general than me. But I will say this. It seems like the Mets got pretty good value for David Peterson, considering he's going to be a free agent at the end of this season, and he was pitching to that over 6 ERA. And this plays into some of the desperation from the Chicago Cubs. We talked about it throughout the week that the Cubs really don't have a lot of pitching, and that's part of the thing that has really crushed their season. It started off with a lot of expectations, and they're kind of just middling and treading water a bit, and it's because they're so decimated in the rotation. They have 6 starting pitchers on the IL, so they needed somebody. They needed to make a move. They needed to be, I don't want to say desperate, but they needed to be urgent. They needed some urgency here. And they go out and they get a guy who they're, I guess, fairly familiar with. They've seen him pitch against them a bunch, and maybe they think that they can untap some stuff and fix some things and whatever for David Peterson. But the Mets get a guy named Cole Mathis, who's young, he's 22 years old. He's split time in single A and high A so far. Numbers are pretty good down there. He's a first base, sort of third base DH type. And look, again, he's young. He's far away, but he's a guy who slots into the Mets system right around 13 or 14. And again, I don't want to make too much of prospect rankings, but the Mets got something more than I would think that they would be able to get for a pitcher like David Peterson, who has been bad now for over a year because he made that all-star team last season and then went into the absolute tank after that. So the back half of last season and all of this season, he's been a bad pitcher. So for a calendar year, he's been bad. He's got that over 6 ERA. He doesn't look like a guy who's pitching with a lot of confidence. He doesn't look like a guy who can really lean on any kind of stuff at this point. And he is a guy, again, who's going to be a free agent. And he's going to be a free agent in a wacky kind of free agent scenario here with a lockout looming in 2027. So not that the Cubs have any designs on keeping him long-term, but it's a guy that you would think you'd have to sell for essentially nothing. And for the Mets to get more than nothing, I'll go ahead and give them kudos for that. And again, if it gets the stink of the Wilpons off of this team once and for good, then good riddance. Next thing up is Mark Vientos. Next thing up is Brett Beatty. Next thing up is Kodai Senga. Next thing up is firing the manager, maybe selling off a piece like Freddie Peralta for some legitimate prospects. Maybe if they dip into their bullpen and trade a Minter or a Rayleigh or even a Luke Weaver, who I'd be a little bit more hesitant to trade. But if the value's there, the value's there. So we're going to talk plenty about the trade season coming up, probably starting next week. And then as we get closer and closer and closer to that August 3rd deadline, we'll be talking a lot about trade rumors, my thoughts on them, my thoughts on, I don't have any insider information, but if I think there's a trade that makes sense for the New York Mets, things like that. And maybe the Mets might even find themselves in a soft buying scenario. And you're going to say, John, they're a terrible team. Why would they buy? What I mean by a soft buy is something that might be able to help them in 2027. Sort of like when they went out and traded for Marcus Stroman. And I know Marcus Stroman is a bad word to throw out here around Mets fandom, but when they acquired Marcus Stroman, it was not only for that season, it was for the future as well. And Marcus Stroman's tenure with the Mets ended very poorly, but there was a time when they did get some good value out of him. So maybe there's a situation where you go and you acquire a player, whether it's a starting pitcher, whether it's a position player, whatever the case may be, where you're looking towards the future. Because again, while the Mets do have some solid building blocks, they do have a lot of questions on this roster too. So I'm never going to complain if the Mets go out and acquire a guy who might play first base or a guy in the rotation or whatever the case may be, who's going to be here beyond the 2026 season. Speaking of that 2026 season, baseball season is here. It's in full swing. As a matter of fact, depending on which team you follow, it might be about halfway through as we're hitting the 81, 82, 83 game mark of the season. And now you can trade every game on Kalshi. And you know what I do? Before I sit down to record this show, I take out my phone, I pop on over to the Kalshi app, and I see if I could find something interesting where you might find some value if you head on over to Kalshi. And I try to make it Mets-centric, but, I think now I'm going to have to get a little bit more creative because I don't think we can expect too much out of our New York Mets moving forward. Now, I'm sure there'll be some interesting player props. I'm sure there'll be some times where the Mets might have an advantage with a starting pitcher. I'm sure there might even be a stretch once things are done and the Mets are absolute toast where maybe they go on a little bit of a run and they're playing a bit better baseball in July or in the dog days of August when other teams are kind of slowing down a little bit. But today is not that day. So I've got an interesting one. Today, the Mets are slated to face Zach Wheeler, former Met Zach Wheeler, for the second time in a week. Now, I think Zach Wheeler is going to do as well as he did against the Mets last week, this week, but it's not about this particular game. There's some good odds on Zach Wheeler being the NL Comeback Player of the Year. Right now, he is the favorite at 79%, which means he is trading at 78 cents a share on the Kalshi app. So $100 will get you $126. Now, it's not a great swing right now, but it is pretty good value for a guy who is sitting as the favorite. And, it's just something worth looking into if you want that little bit of a Mets connection, not only for the game this weekend, not only for the game coming up tonight, but if you say, hey, you know what? I like Zach Wheeler when he was here. I wish the Mets never got rid of him, and I'm rooting for him from afar, even though he's a Philadelphia Philly now. Maybe you want to see what you can see about Zach Wheeler being the comeback player of the year. On Kalshi, you're trading against peers in a live market, meaning there is no house, and as the probability changes, you can buy into and out of your position. For a limited time, you already know, download the Kalshi app and use the code FANARCHBASEBALL to get $10 when you trade 10. Kalshi, trade on anything. Must be 18 and over. Restrictions and eligibility requirements apply. Event contract trading involves risks and may not be suitable for all investors. Prices, values, and available markets may differ from those mentioned. For more information, see kalshi.com/regulatory. Marcus Semien. He of the 2 errors in one game. He of the 2 errors plus the misplay in one game. That game that really signified 2 nights ago the final blow, the death knell for the New York Mets as they lost in one of the most embarrassing fashions possible. Marcus Semien apparently, ladies and gentlemen, was hurt after that game. And prior to last night's game, it was announced that he was going on the IL. I say apparently hurt, and I don't mean to be so pig-headed when I say that because these guys are athletes. These guys do get hurt. I'm sure there's something going on, but man, oh man, is the timing convenient for Marcus Semien. Has one of his worst games, obviously, as a Met, maybe one of the worst games of his career. He's already a guy who started behind the 8 ball in his Mets career because people were upset that the Mets traded Brandon Nimmo for him and they got this old guy who was overpaid and blah, 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 blah. Set up for failure, and he's sort of in a lot of ways lived up to that failure. Had his worst defensive season thus far, which is remarkable considering he won a Gold Glove last season. His defensive metrics last season graded out incredibly positively. And when the Mets traded for him, they traded for him for the run prevention. They traded for him to solidify the up-the-middle defense. They thought maybe he could bat 8th or 7th or 9th or whatever on a really good team, contribute a little bit offensively, but the defense. And where did it go? I have no idea. The defense is gone. And it's frustrating because I, for one, was bullish on the defense. If you look at not only his metrics, but if you look at the fact that Marcus Semien's sprint speed, which helps on defense, especially up the middle, but obviously, of course, is a base runner as well. Marcus Semien's sprint speed, despite the fact that he's 35 years old, has pretty much maintained over the last several years of his career. So you're like, he's really athletic still. He's got great hands. If nothing else, he'll play good defense. Well, he hasn't exactly done that. And now he hits the IL with, I'm going to go ahead and call, a bruised ego. Because I don't know what else to make of this. Coming up to replace him is Ronnie Mauricio, who I think is going to get a legitimate shot here at second base, at third base in Marcus Semien's stead. I think the Mets might get a little creative and maybe put Bo Bichette at second base, which is a position that I think he's comfortable playing. He played for the Blue Jays in the playoffs and in the World Series last year, and I think it's a position that the Mets would maybe like to see if he can play going forward. And I think if you're Bo Bichette and you're even considering opting out, you might want to go and play a little bit of second base too, because it will help your value. I know Bo Bichette has made a couple errors at third, but Bo Bichette has graded out very positively at third base. And I think that whether his future is there with the Mets or somewhere else, I think that it's shown that he can play third base, certainly better than he can play shortstop. We know he's a bad defensive shortstop, but I think the ability to market yourself as a second baseman or a third baseman, which I think he was already doing, but I think to solidify that would be good for Bichette. And I think Mauricio can play, again, he's another guy who grades positively out at third base, and the Mets don't seem to love him at second base. But I think they'll be a little creative with both of those guys, as far as Marcus Semien being down for at least a little bit goes. He's on the 10-day IL. How long will he be out? Who knows? Might just be 10 days, might be a bit longer. I guess we'll see. But the biggest issue that I have with this Marcus Semien situation is that it's another thing that just makes the Mets look bad and inept in 2026. Because Carlos Mendoza, before the game, when they announced he was going on the IL, on his press conference, he said, this has been something that Marcus Semien has been dealing with for a while. For a while. And I need to understand, if Marcus Semien at 35 years old, with his defense all of a sudden getting worse and his offense trending down over the last couple seasons, is hurt, why is he playing every single day? Before last night's game, Marcus Semien did not miss a game for the New York Mets. And I know that historically he has been a bit of an Iron Man, and I think he deserves credit for that, because a lot of guys in baseball don't play every day. But it's so frustrating to me that at this stage in his career, when the Mets were floundering and Marcus Semien was not playing his best, that they just continued to run him out there every single night. Especially now if you're telling me that he was dealing with something that maybe was affecting him. Now, I don't necessarily buy that. But of course, we know the phantom IL thing is sort of a thing of the past. You could still manipulate things a bit, but there's got to be a real injury. There's got to be something that doctors can actually point to that you can really document. This isn't just like, oh, he's got, a back strain, or is something's going on with his eye. He's got something in his eye yesterday. We're going to put him on the IL. You can't really manipulate it that way anymore. You have to really have an injury that you can point to, that you can diagnose. And so there's probably something there, but the timing of this after he has such a bad game is so convenient. For them to then turn around and say, no, he's been dealing with this for a while, it's more malpractice by the Mets. Now, on the flip side of things, I understand with Lindor out and some of these other players out, could you give the Mets credit, or could you give Marcus Semien credit because maybe he was playing through something? I mean, maybe. But if that's the case, then why wasn't Marcus Semien put on the IL when Lindor was activated? That's why I don't buy it. If you're like, look, they have nowhere else to go. They have nowhere else to go. Okay, well, Lindor was activated and they kept Semien on the roster. And not only was Lindor activated 2 days ago, but Ronnie Mauricio was activated and optioned to AAA. So if Mauricio was ready to come back 2 days ago, then why wasn't Simeon IL'd? And you say, listen, guys, honestly, he's been dealing with something for a while. We just didn't know where else to go. We didn't have another option. The Mets got 2 options back in 1 day. And they just decided, let's let Marcus Semien go and play another game, play in this doubleheader. And now, after that, now he's hurt. Something stinks, man. Something stinks. So it's either he was hurt and the Mets didn't handle the injury properly. And where have you heard that before? Or he's not really hurt and now they're trying to give him some kind of mental break after having an abysmal game. I mean, the whole thing just reeks of ineptitude. Whether it's real or fake, it's a bad look, it's a bad move. It makes the Mets look like fools, and it makes the Mets look like they don't know what they're doing. And I never thought, like I said yesterday, that I would watch a David Stearns-run organization look as bad as the Mets have looked in 2026. When you point to certain things that happened in 2025, you could say, yeah, man, there were things Stearns could have did better. There were some things that didn't work out. There were some things that maybe were doomed to fail from the beginning, relying on Frankie Montas, this guy, that guy, whatever. They could have went to Nola McLean earlier. There was a lot of what ifs. There was a lot of, I can't believe they did this. But some of that you could chalk up to Monday morning quarterbacking, if we're being fair. Everything that's happened in 2026, I don't think that you could chalk it up to Monday morning quarterbacking. There's been so many things that have gone wrong. And I'm not even talking about the decisions in the offseason. The decisions in the offseason, the moves that they made. I just mean since the season has started, how they've handled injuries, how they've handled players, how they've not fired managers, how they've refused to DFA people. The whole thing reeks like a team that doesn't know what they're doing. And when you have a team that is in that kind of a situation, you have what has happened over the last 2 games at Citi Field happen, which is the crowd chanting for Pete Alonso. And that is so embarrassing on so many levels. It's embarrassing for Stearns. It's embarrassing for Cohen. And it's embarrassing for the Mets fans who are doing it. No one here looks good. No one here is coming out of this situation where you're chanting for Pete Alonso looking good. Because if you don't know me for a long time, if you haven't followed my work, let me say this. I was a huge Pete Alonso fan. Massive. Supported Pete Alonso from day one. Supported Pete Alonso when they said he wasn't good. Supported Pete Alonso through his down year in 2024 until everybody turned when he hit that monster home run that saved the season, despite the fact that people wanted him off the team prior to that. I wanted Pete Alonso back when they re-signed him last year. I wanted Pete Alonso back when they didn't re-sign him this year. I thought Pete Alonso was the type of guy that could provide value for you just by going out there and hitting home runs, even if he didn't age necessarily well. I thought the Mets had the financial wherewithal to cover him not aging well in the back half of that contract. If he was good for 2 or 3 more years, you stomach the back half. I wanted him back. I said on record on my other show and on Twitter that I would have given him the exact deal that the Baltimore Orioles gave him. However, that's me if I was doing things. I also understood why the Mets didn't give Pete Alonso the deal that the Orioles gave to him. I understood why they didn't want to. But on the flip side of things, it's not that they didn't bring Pete Alonso back. It's how they decided to try to replace Pete Alonso. To jump the market on Jorge Polanco, who I don't care about the never playing first base before, really. I don't. But I understand that's a factor in this too if you really want to be angry about it. To jump the market on Jorge Polanco, when there were first basemen out there, Wilson Contreras, who did get traded, who you could have gotten because obviously he was dealt, and Christian Walker, who you could have traded, even though he wasn't dealt ultimately by the Astros, you probably could have traded for him if you really wanted to. Those are two guys who fit the run prevention mold because they're good defensive first basemen. Those are two guys who fit the clutch player mold because they are guys who have produced a lot, knocked in a lot of runs. They are guys who fit the right-handed hitter mold. And in the case of Christian Walker especially, they're guys who have hit a lot of home runs. Not Pete Alonso level most years, but they would give you pop. Again, Contreras a little less, but Christian Walker would have given you some. So there were definitely ways to criticize the Mets' plan post-Alonso, even if you separate the fact that Alonso bringing him back was a good or a bad idea, whatever. If you wanted to bring him back, maybe you're in the camp of you just wanted him and you don't care about anything else. But if you're okay with not bringing him back like I was, there were other things that would have made more sense than what they ultimately set out and did. And that's where I think you could really have the problem. However, he's gone. And Pete Alonso, for all of his positives, was a deeply flawed player. Pete Alonso was here for 7 years, and he was a prime part of the core that failed more than they succeeded. Is that all of his fault? No, but he was here for it. Pete Alonso was a guy who we saw disappear, be incredibly streaky, be a guy who could not get out of his own way. Hell, we saw it in 2024 until he hit that big home run in the postseason. People wanted him gone. People said, that's it, he's on the decline. We don't want to deal with this anymore. This home run or bust, swinging at sliders away and all of this stuff. So let's not pretend, and again, I am a Pete Alonso fan, but let's not have a selective memory about what kind of player he was. He was a guy who, when the Mets were down bad, he could be down bad right along with them. Now, he was also a guy who could carry a team for a month. I know. I watched it. It was great. But he was a guy who, when the Mets were in the middle of a 12-game losing streak like they were in April, he'd be right there. He'd be a culprit. When the Mets are making errors and mental mistakes and swinging at bad pitches and having terrible at-bats, because all of that stuff can be contagious, Pete Alonso was a culprit. Pete Alonso could have done that. Now, if you want Pete Alonso back because of the home runs, if you want Pete Alonso back because he's homegrown, if you wanted Pete Alonso back for whatever reason, I get it. But again, let's not have a selective memory about the type of player that he was. And chanting for him in 2026, like it would have made all of the difference in the world, it's embarrassing. Now, it is embarrassing for Stearns, and it is embarrassing for Cohen, because I don't know that they handled the situation right with him and then after him. But it's embarrassing for you too if you're chanting it. And if you thought that chanting it was a good idea because you weren't there, you should also be a bit embarrassed. Because Pete Alonso wasn't going to fix this mess. Would the Mets be slightly better with Pete Alonso? Maybe. The Mets haven't hit home runs and the Mets haven't driven in runs. And the two things you know Pete Alonso will do is hit home runs and drive in runs. So, would they have won a couple more games here or there? Probably. But I don't think they'd be a 500 baseball team because of Pete Alonso. Would they be 13 games under? Maybe not. Maybe they'd be 10. Maybe they'd be 9. I don't think he's changing the dynamic of what is proven to be a pretty awful baseball team here in 2026. So my final word to the wise for the week is don't embarrass yourself. Don't get hung up on the past. And just understand that it's time to move on. Time to move on from Pete. And probably as we start next week, time to move on from the 2026 Mets, despite the fact that there's 81 games left to play, which feels like a punishment. That's going to do it for this episode of Mets Daily. If you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. We're sitting at just over 4,000 subscribers. We'd love to get to 5,000. And more importantly than that, we would love for you to be a part of that 5,000 as we continue to grow here on Mets Daily across the Fan Arch Network. Until next time, I'm John Saponaro. See you Monday.